The salt wind carried the stench of rotting fish and unwashed bodies through the open door of Kelly's Tavern, where Captain Ezra Blackwood sat hunched over a pewter mug of dark rum. At 68 years old, his weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent decades squinting into ocean spray and tropical sun. Gray whiskers sprouted from his jaw in uneven patches, and his pale blue eyes, once sharp as winter ice, now seemed clouded with age and exhaustion. His gnarled hands, scarred by rope burns and knife cuts, trembled slightly as he lifted the mug to his cracked lips. Mary Thornton moved between the tavern's rough wooden tables with practiced grace, her auburn hair tied back with a frayed ribbon and her simple brown dress patched at the elbows. She was barely 20, with kind green eyes that sparkled when she smiled at the old sailors who frequented the establishment. When she approached Ezra's corner table, her expression softened with genuine warmth. "Good evening, Captain Blackwood," she said, refilling his mug from a clay pitcher. "Will you be wanting some of Mrs. Kelly's fish stew tonight?" Ezra's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, rough as barnacles scraping against a ship's hull. "Just the rum tonight, lass. Thank you kindly." The tavern door slammed open with enough force to rattle the oil-stained windows, and 5 men swaggered inside like they owned the place. Their leader, a mountain of muscle and malice named Iron Jack Malone, stood nearly 6.5 feet tall with arms thick as ship masts. His black beard was braided with bits of colored rope, and a cutlass hung from his leather belt alongside a collection of wicked-looking knives. Behind him followed his crew of dock workers and ship riggers, each one scarred and mean-looking, their clothes reeking of tar and sweat. Iron Jack's voice boomed across the tavern, silencing the low conversations and nervous laughter. Well, what have we here? Little Mary working hard for her pennies." The young woman's face went pale as she clutched the pitcher tighter against her chest. "Good evening, Mr. Malone. What can I bring you gentlemen tonight? But before you find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this tale of the high seas, hit that like button and comment what port you're watching from. These stories sail to every corner of the world, and I love seeing where our adventures take you." Iron Jack ignored her question and gestured broadly at the tavern's modest interior. "You know, Mary, this place could use some protection. Lots of dangerous men come through these docks. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to such a pretty little thing." His crew spread out behind him, blocking the exits with practiced efficiency. One of them, a wiry man with a gold tooth, reached out and grabbed Mary's wrist as she tried to step back. She gasped and nearly dropped the pitcher, rum splashing onto the stained floorboards. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." Iron Jack's laugh was like the sound of grinding metal. "Nothing wrong. That's rich. See, Mary, running a business in this port costs money. Protection money. And Mr. Kelly seems to think he can operate without paying his fair share." The tavern had gone completely silent except for the nervous shuffling of feet and the creak of old timber. Patrons hunched over their drinks, trying to make themselves invisible. In his corner, Ezra continued to stare into his rum as if nothing was happening, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the mug. Iron Jack grabbed Mary by the shoulders and shook her roughly. "When I'm talking to you, girl, you look at me. Leave the girl be." The words came from Ezra's corner, spoken so quietly that they barely carried across the room. Iron Jack turned slowly, his cruel eyes fixing on the old man who dared to interrupt him. "What did you say, Grandpa?" Ezra finally looked up, his pale eyes meeting Iron Jack's stare without flinching. "I said leave the girl be. She's done nothing to deserve your attentions." Iron Jack's crew began to chuckle and mutter among themselves. The gold-toothed man released Mary's wrist and swaggered toward Ezra's table. "Look at this old salt, boys. Thinks he's still got some fight left in those ancient bones." Iron Jack followed, his heavy boots thundering against the floorboards. He loomed over Ezra's table like a storm cloud, casting the old man in shadow. "You know what I think, old-timer? I think you've had too much to drink. I think you should mind your own business before someone gets hurt." Ezra took another sip of his rum, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "And I think you should take your business elsewhere before someone gets hurt." The tavern erupted in nervous laughter from Iron Jack's crew, but their leader's face darkened with rage. He reached across the table and grabbed an empty bottle from a neighboring chair, raising it high above his head. The glass caught the lamplight as he brought it down with crushing force against the side of Ezra's skull. The bottle exploded into a shower of green glass that scattered across the table and floor. The sound echoed through the tavern like a gunshot, followed by absolute silence. Blood began to trickle down Ezra's temple, staining his gray whiskers crimson, but he didn't move. He didn't even blink. Iron Jack stepped back, his confident grin faltering as he stared at the old man who should have been unconscious on the floor. Instead, Ezra simply reached up with one weathered hand and wiped the blood away, then slowly, deliberately, reached for something at his belt. The curved blade that emerged from its leather sheath was unlike any knife the dock workers had ever seen. The steel gleamed with an oily black finish, and the handle was carved from yellowed whale bone, etched with intricate scrimshaw depicting sea monsters and sailing ships. The blade itself was nearly 8 inches long and curved like a shark's tooth, designed for the close-quarters combat of ship-boarding actions. Iron Jack's crew took an involuntary step backward as Ezra rose from his chair. The old man seemed to unfold like a piece of maritime rigging, his stooped posture straightening until he stood at his full height. His pale eyes had turned cold as winter seas, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades spent in life-or-death struggles on rolling decks. "Now then," he said, his words carrying clearly through the silent tavern, "shall we discuss this like civilized men?" The whalebone handle felt familiar in Ezra's weathered palm, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. He stood slowly, deliberately, his movements flowing like water over ship timber. The curved blade caught the lamplight and threw dancing shadows across the tavern walls as Iron Jack's crew spread out in a loose semicircle, their confidence returning as they realized the odds still favored them 5-1. "You're making a mistake, old man," Iron Jack snarled, flexing his massive hands. "That little pig sticker won't save you from what's coming." The gold-toothed rigger circled to Ezra's left while 2 others moved to flank his right side. A 4th man, barrel-chested with arms like tree trunks, positioned himself near the tavern door to block any escape. They moved with the practiced coordination of men who had done this many times before, herding their prey like wolves cornering a wounded deer. But in the far corner of the tavern, sitting hunched over a ledger book and a mug of ale, young Thomas Hartwell felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. At 25 years old, Thomas served as the port's assistant harbor master, and his father had filled his childhood with stories of the legendary pirates and pirate hunters who once prowled these very waters. The knife in the old man's hand was no common seaman's blade. The distinctive curve of the steel, the yellowed whalebone grip carved with intricate scrimshaw, the way the metal seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Thomas had seen drawings of that weapon in his father's old maritime records. "Sweet Mary, mother of pearl," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the scraping of boots on floorboards. "That's the bone knife of Tortuga." Iron Jack's crew closed in like a tightening noose, but Ezra's entire demeanor had undergone a transformation that defied his apparent age and frailty. His stooped shoulders squared themselves, his shuffling gait became the balanced stance of a man accustomed to fighting on rolling ship decks in heavy weather. Most unsettling of all, his pale blue eyes had turned flat and emotionless as winter ice, the gaze of a man who had looked upon death so many times that it no longer held any mystery for him. The gold-toothed rigger made the first move, lunging forward with a sailor's knife aimed at Ezra's ribs. But the old man moved like flowing water, sidestepping the clumsy attack and bringing his curved blade up in a precise arc that opened the rigger's wrist to the bone. The man screamed and dropped his weapon, clutching his severed tendons as blood sprayed across the tavern floor. Iron Jack roared with fury and swung a massive fist toward Ezra's head, but the old man had already shifted his weight, using the momentum of his previous attack to flow into the next movement. He drove his knee upward with surgical precision, connecting with Iron Jack's solar plexus and driving the air from the giant's lungs in an explosive wheeze. Behind his ledger book, Thomas Hartwell's face had gone white as sailcloth. He rose on trembling legs, pointing a shaking finger at the old man who moved through Iron Jack's crew like death incarnate. "Boys," he called out in a voice cracked with awe and terror, That's Captain Ezra Blackwood, the Reaper of the Caribbean. The remaining attackers hesitated, confusion flickering across their brutal faces. They had never heard the name, but Thomas's obvious terror gave them pause. Iron Jack, still gasping for breath and clutching his stomach, looked up at the old man with new wariness. "You're lying, boy," Iron Jack wheezed. "This is just some washed-up old salt who's had too much rum." But Ezra had moved to the center of the tavern floor, his blade weaving hypnotic patterns in the lamplit air. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room with the authority of a man who had commanded ships in battle and ordered men to their deaths. 30 years I sailed the Caribbean waters, hunting pirates and slavers. 43 men I killed, all of them scum who preyed on the innocent and defenseless. I served under Captain Morrison of the Righteous Fury, cleared 17 pirate vessels from stem to stern, left their decks running red with the blood of murderers and thieves. The barrel-chested man near the door made a desperate grab for Ezra's back, but the old captain spun with fluid grace, his curved blade tracing a silver line through the air. The attacker's belt split cleanly in two, dropping his trousers around his ankles and sending him tumbling face first into a table laden with empty mugs and wooden bowls. Mary Thornton had pressed herself against the far wall, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as she watched the gentle old man who had always spoken to her with such kindness transform into something from the darkest maritime legends. The blood trickling down his temple made him look like some ancient sea demon risen from the depths to claim vengeance. Thomas Hartwell's voice shook as he continued his horrified recitation of Ezra's legend. They called him the Reaper because he never left survivors among pirate crews. Boarding parties would find ships full of dead men and not a mark on the cargo or passengers. The pirates' own weapons turned against them, their own ropes used to hang them from their own yardarms. Iron Jack tried to rally his remaining men, gesturing wildly with hands that now trembled with uncertainty rather than rage. "He's just one old man. There's still 3 of us left. Rush him together, and he can't stop us all." But the confidence had drained from his crew like water through a broken hull. They had seen 2 of their number disabled in seconds by an opponent they had dismissed as a helpless old drunk. The way the curved blade moved in Ezra's hands spoke of decades of practice. Muscle memory burned so deep that age could not erode it. The 4th attacker, a lean man with sailor's tattoos covering his arms, tried to circle behind Ezra while Iron Jack provided a distraction. But the old captain's awareness encompassed the entire tavern like a spider sensing vibrations in its web. Without turning around, he spoke in that same deadly quiet voice. "The man behind me is 3 steps away, favoring his left leg from an old injury. The man to my right is drunk, and his reactions are slow. Iron Jack is wounded and breathing hard. Poor tactical positioning, gentlemen. You've blocked your own escape routes and left yourselves no room to maneuver." The tattooed sailor froze mid-step, suddenly aware that he was being hunted rather than hunting. Ezra turned slowly to face him, the whalebone knife held low and ready. "I came to this quiet port to forget the killing," Ezra continued, his pale eyes reflecting the lamp flames like chips of ice in firelight. "I thought my violent days were behind me. I was wrong." Thomas Hartwell stood on trembling legs, his ledger book tumbling forgotten to the floor as decades of maritime history crystallized before his horrified eyes. The young harbor master's voice cracked with awe and terror as he addressed the frozen tableau of violence in the center of the tavern. "Boys, that's not just any blade. That's the bone knife of Tortuga, carved from the jaw of a great white shark that killed 17 men before Captain Blackwood put a harpoon through its brain. The scrimshaw work was done by his own hand during the long voyage home from the Mosquito Coast, where he single-handedly cleared the pirate stronghold of Bones Bay." Iron Jack's remaining crew members exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist before the tropical sun. The gold-toothed rigger sat on the floor clutching his severed wrist tendons, his face pale with blood loss and growing shock. The barrel-chested man struggled to pull up his ruined trousers while keeping his eyes fixed on Ezra's blade. Thomas continued his recitation, his voice gaining strength as childhood memories of his father's stories came flooding back. They called him the Reaper because he could board a pirate vessel with just that knife and a length of rope, and by dawn every cutthroat aboard would be feeding the sharks. The British Admiralty gave him a letter of marque to hunt slavers from Port Royal to the Windward Passage. 43 confirmed kills, each one a murderer or worse. Iron Jack wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his massive hand, his cruel confidence replaced by the growing realization that he had picked a fight with a living legend. "This is impossible," he muttered. "The Reaper died years ago in a hurricane off Cape Hatteras. Everyone knows that story." Ezra's pale eyes fixed on Iron Jack with the intensity of a man sighting down a rifle barrel. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," he said in that same deadly quiet voice. "Though I admit I encouraged them. Retirement is easier when the world thinks you're dead." The tattooed sailor who had been circling behind Ezra took a step backward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Now hold on there, Captain. We didn't know who you were. This is just a misunderstanding between working men." But Ezra had begun to move again, not toward any of his opponents, but to a coil of rope hanging from a hook beside the bar. His movements remained fluid and purposeful as he shook out the hemp line, testing its weight and flexibility with the practiced hands of a man who had spent decades working ship rigging in all weather. "Misunderstanding," Ezra repeated, his voice carrying the faintest hint of dark amusement. "You call terrorizing an innocent girl a misunderstanding. You call demanding protection money from honest folk a misunderstanding. I call it piracy, and I've been killing pirates since before you were born." With a motion so quick it seemed to blur, Ezra flicked his wrist and sent a loop of rope sailing through the air. The makeshift lasso settled around the tattooed sailor's shoulders and tightened with a sharp snap. Before the man could react, Ezra had pulled him off his feet and sent him sliding across the tavern floor to crash into a pile of empty barrels near the kitchen door. The fourth crew member, a scar-faced brute with arms like ship's cables, tried to rush Ezra while the captain's attention seemed focused on the rope work. But Ezra's awareness encompassed the entire room like a spider sensing every tremor in its web. Without looking, he stepped aside and used the attacking man's own momentum to send him stumbling past and crashing headfirst into the tavern's stone fireplace. Thomas Hartwell's voice rose to a near whisper of reverence as he continued his catalog of Ezra's legendary exploits. "My father served under Admiral Vernon, and he told me about the Reaper's boarding techniques. Said he could clear a ship's deck in under 10 minutes using nothing but rope and steel. Saw him take the slave ship Bleeding Heart single-handed, freed 200 souls chained in her hold." Iron Jack backed toward the tavern door, his massive frame suddenly looking less imposing as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his thick skull. "You're all mad," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is just some crazy old drunk with a knife and a head full of rum-soaked fantasies." Ezra began to advance across the tavern floor, his curved blade held low and ready, the rope coiled in his other hand like a striking serpent. Each step was perfectly balanced, the gait of a man accustomed to fighting on rolling ship decks in heavy weather. His pale eyes never left Iron Jack's face, reading every tell and micro-expression like a maritime weather gauge. "Fantasies," Ezra repeated softly. "Tell me, Jack, have you ever seen a man die by inches from blood loss? Have you ever heard the sound a cutlass makes when it parts flesh from bone? I have. 43 times I've listened to that sound, and each time I told myself it was justice for the innocent lives these men had taken." The gold-toothed rigger whimpered from his position on the floor, pressing his good hand against his wounded wrist in a desperate attempt to stem the bleeding. "Please, Captain," he gasped. "We surrender. We didn't know. We're just dock workers trying to make a living." But Ezra's attention remained fixed on Iron Jack, the leader who had started this confrontation by striking an innocent woman. The captain's voice dropped even lower, becoming barely more than a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent tavern. "A living earned by terrorizing girls and extorting honest merchants. A living built on fear and violence. I've killed better men than you for lesser crimes. Pirates at least had the courage to face their victims on the open sea. You prey on the helpless in dark alleys and quiet taverns." Mary Thornton pressed herself against the far wall, her green eyes wide with fascination and terror as she watched the gentle old man who had always spoken to her with grandfatherly kindness, reveal himself as something from the darkest maritime legends. The blood still trickled down his temple from where the bottle had struck him, but he moved as if the injury meant nothing at all. Iron Jack's back hit the tavern door with a solid thud, and he fumbled behind him for the handle while keeping his eyes fixed on Ezra's approaching form. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I've got money. Gold coins from ships we've worked. Take it all. Just let us walk away from this." Ezra stopped 3 paces away, close enough that Iron Jack could see every scar and line on the old captain's weathered face. Close enough to see the absolute certainty in those pale blue eyes, the look of a man who had made the decision to kill and felt no doubt about the rightness of his choice. "I didn't come out of retirement for your gold, Jack. I came out because some things are worth fighting for. Some lines cannot be crossed without consequence. You crossed one tonight when you laid hands on that girl." Iron Jack's hand found the brass handle of the tavern door behind him, but before he could turn it, his desperation transformed into the cornered fury of a wounded animal. His massive hand dropped to the cutlass at his belt, drawing the curved blade with a metallic rasp that cut through the tavern's tense silence like a ship's bell in fog. "I'll get you like a fish, old man," Iron Jack snarled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You want to play the legendary pirate hunter? Let's see how your stories hold up against cold steel." The cutlass was a brutal thing, nearly 3 feet of sharpened iron with a brass handguard green with verdigris. Iron Jack had used it to intimidate countless dock workers and merchants, its weight and reach giving him an overwhelming advantage in the close confines of waterfront brawls. Against an elderly man armed with only a knife, he should have held every advantage. But Ezra looked at the sword with the calm assessment of a professional, his pale eyes cataloging the weapon's strengths and weaknesses with decades of combat experience. The cutlass was heavy and designed for slashing attacks, effective against untrained opponents, but clumsy in skilled hands. More importantly, Iron Jack held it like a club rather than a blade, his grip too tight and his stance unbalanced. 44 then, Ezra said with quiet resignation, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had hoped his killing days were finished. He shifted his stance, the tavern floor becoming the rolling deck of a warship beneath his feet. The whalebone knife felt alive in his weathered hand, its curved edge singing with anticipation. Iron Jack lunged forward with all the subtlety of a charging bull, his cutlass whistling through the air in a vicious horizontal slash aimed at Ezra's neck. But the old captain had read the attack in the young man's eyes and shoulders, sidestepping the blade with fluid grace and allowing Iron Jack's momentum to carry him past. As the giant stumbled by, Ezra's knife flicked out like a serpent's tongue, opening a thin red line across Iron Jack's sword arm from wrist to elbow. The cut was precise and surgical, designed to weaken grip strength without causing permanent damage. Blood began to seep through the torn fabric of Jack's shirt, but the wound was far from fatal. Iron Jack roared with pain and fury, spinning around and bringing his cutlass down in a devastating overhead chop that would have split Ezra's skull like a melon. But the old captain was no longer where the blade fell. He had flowed sideways like water, using the tavern's heavy wooden support beam as a shield while his knife sought another opening. The cutlass bit deep into the beam with a solid thunk, embedding itself in the seasoned oak. Iron Jack cursed and tried to wrench his weapon free, but Ezra was already moving. The old captain grabbed a coil of rope from behind the bar and flicked his wrist, sending a loop sailing through the air to settle around Iron Jack's ankle. With a sharp yank, Ezra pulled Iron Jack's feet out from under him. The giant crashed to the tavern floor, his cutlass finally coming free from the beam to go skittering across the wooden planks. But Iron Jack was far from finished. He rolled aside as Ezra's knife sparked against the floorboards where his head had been, then kicked out with both boots to catch the old captain in the chest. The impact sent Ezra staggering backward, his breath driven from his lungs in an explosive gasp. For a moment his age showed, his weathered face gray with pain as he fought to remain standing. Iron Jack seized the advantage, lunging for his fallen cutlass while Ezra recovered his balance. But as Iron Jack's fingers closed around the weapon's brass hilt, memory crashed over Ezra like a tropical squall. Suddenly he was 30 years younger, standing on the blood-slicked deck of the pirate vessel Crimson Tide, as cutlass-wielding buccaneers swarmed around him like angry wasps. His younger self had moved with deadly purpose, the whalebone knife carving arcs of silver through the humid Caribbean air as pirates fell screaming into the shark-infested waters below. The flashback lasted only seconds, but it restored Ezra's focus with crystalline clarity. Iron Jack rose to his feet with the cutlass in hand, but the old captain was already in motion. Ezra grabbed a wooden chair and hurled it at Iron Jack's head, forcing the giant to bring up his blade to deflect the improvised missile. While Iron Jack was distracted, Ezra vaulted over a nearby table with surprising agility for his age. He landed behind the giant and immediately went to work with the efficiency of a master craftsman. The whalebone knife traced a precise pattern across Iron Jack's back, slicing through his shirt and the leather straps of his sword belt without touching skin. Iron Jack spun around, swinging his cutlass in a wild arc, but his ruined belt chose that moment to give way completely. His trousers dropped around his ankles, hobbling his movement and destroying his balance. He windmilled his arms frantically, trying to stay upright, while simultaneously fighting and pulling up his pants. Ezra stepped back and watched with professional detachment as Iron Jack struggled with his predicament. The tavern's other patrons had long since fled or taken cover, leaving only Mary huddled behind the bar and Thomas Hartwell pressed against the far wall. The young harbor master stared in fascination as living history played out before his eyes. "This is how it always ended with pirates," Ezra said conversationally, his breathing only slightly elevated despite the intensity of the combat. They relied on intimidation and superior numbers. When faced with an opponent who refused to be cowed, they fell apart like poorly made rigging in a storm. Iron Jack finally managed to kick free of his fallen trousers, but his humiliation had transformed into cold rage. He gripped the cutlass with both hands and began a series of methodical attacks, using his reach advantage to keep Ezra at bay while he looked for an opening to land a killing blow. But Ezra had spent 3 decades fighting in the confined spaces of ship cabins and holds, where a man's life depended on his ability to turn any object into a weapon. He grabbed a pewter mug from a nearby table and hurled it at Iron Jack's face, then followed up with a wooden bowl that struck the giant's sword hand. Iron Jack's grip on the cutlass loosened for just an instant, but that was all Ezra needed. The old captain's knife flashed out in a complex pattern, striking the cutlass blade at 3 precise points in rapid succession. The impacts sent vibrations through the steel that numbed Iron Jack's fingers, and finally sent the weapon spinning away to clatter against the tavern's stone fireplace. Disarmed and bleeding from multiple superficial wounds, Iron Jack fell to his knees on the tavern floor. His massive frame shook with exhaustion and shock as he stared up at the old man who had systematically dismantled him with surgical precision. Ezra stood over him with the whalebone knife held ready, but his pale eyes showed no satisfaction in victory. "Please," Iron Jack gasped, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "I didn't know who you were. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything." Ezra studied the beaten man for a long moment, weighing justice against mercy in the scales of his conscience. The younger version of himself would have finished the job without hesitation, adding Iron Jack's name to the list of 43 dead pirates. But 3 years of peaceful retirement had softened some of the hardest edges of his nature. "Mercy is something I learned in retirement, Jack," Ezra said finally, lowering his knife. "Pirates never showed it to their victims, but I'm not a pirate. I'm a protector of the innocent, and the innocent are safe now." The heavy footsteps of armed men echoed from the tavern's front porch as the harbor patrol arrived, drawn by reports of violence from terrified witnesses who had fled the scene. Captain Morrison pushed through the door first, his weathered face scanning the aftermath of battle with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of waterfront brawls. Behind him came 4 uniformed constables carrying clubs and pistols, ready for whatever carnage awaited them inside. But Morrison stopped short when he saw the figure standing in the center of the tavern, whalebone knife still held loosely in one weathered hand. The harbor captain's jaw dropped open as recognition dawned, his military bearing faltering for the first time in decades of service. "Captain Ezra Blackwood," Morrison breathed, his voice filled with the reverence of a man addressing a living legend. "Sir, we heard reports you had died in the hurricane off Cape Hatteras 3 years ago." Ezra turned slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Morrison's stare with weary resignation. "The reports were premature, Captain, though I confess I did nothing to correct them. A man can only retire from violence if the world believes him dead." Morrison's gaze swept the tavern, taking in the scattered bodies of Iron Jack's crew. The gold-toothed rigger sat propped against a wall, clutching his bandaged wrist, his face pale with blood loss, but very much alive. The barrel-chested man nursed a splitting headache beside the fireplace, his clothing torn but his breathing steady. The tattooed sailor groaned softly from his position tangled in rope near the kitchen door, and the scar-faced brute was slowly regaining consciousness after his collision with the stone hearth. Iron Jack himself knelt in the center of the carnage, his massive frame reduced to trembling submission as blood seeped from a dozen precise cuts that would heal without permanent damage. His cutlass lay forgotten by the fireplace, and his earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man who had looked into the abyss and seen his own mortality reflected back. All alive, Morrison observed with professional interest. In the old days, reports said the Reaper left no survivors among pirate crews. Ezra sheathed his knife with practiced efficiency, the whalebone handle disappearing into its leather scabbard. "The old days were different times, Captain. I was a younger man then, harder and more certain about the righteousness of killing. Age has taught me the value of mercy when it can be afforded." Mary Thornton emerged from behind the bar where she had taken shelter during the fight, her green eyes wide with gratitude and lingering shock. She approached Ezra slowly, as if afraid he might vanish like a phantom if she moved too quickly. When she reached him, she stood on her toes and placed a gentle kiss on his weathered cheek, her lips warm against his saltron skin. "Thank you, Captain Blackwood," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life tonight. You saved all of us." Ezra's weathered features softened as he looked down at the young woman, his expression returning to the grandfatherly kindness she had always known. "It was nothing more than any decent man would have done, lass. These waters have enough predators without letting them walk among honest folk." Morrison gestured to his constables, who began the process of binding Iron Jack's crew with professional efficiency. The harbor captain's expression was grim as he surveyed the human wreckage scattered around the tavern floor. "What's to be done with them, Captain Blackwood?" Morrison asked, deferring to the legendary fighter's judgment. "By rights, assault and extortion carry heavy penalties in this port." Iron Jack looked up with desperate eyes, his voice cracking as he addressed Ezra directly. "Please, sir, I know I got no right to ask mercy after what I done, but I got a wife and 2 little ones back in Charleston. They ain't seen me in 6 months, and the money I've been sending home is all that keeps them fed." Ezra studied the broken man for a long moment, weighing justice against compassion in the scales of his conscience. The younger version of himself would have shown no such consideration for a pirate's family, but 3 years of peaceful retirement had taught him that even the worst men were more than just their crimes. "A work detail," Ezra said finally. 6 months hard labor maintaining the harbor fortifications under Captain Morrison's supervision. The injured men get medical treatment, but they work as soon as they're able, and they're banned from every tavern and drinking house in port. If I hear they've so much as raised their voices to a serving girl, they'll discover I'm not as merciful the second time around." Morrison nodded approvingly and began issuing orders to his constables. The wounded would be taken to the port surgeon for treatment, then transferred to the harbor workhouse where they would spend the next half-year breaking rocks and repairing seawalls under armed guard. As word of the confrontation spread through the port, curious onlookers began to gather outside the tavern. Sailors and dock workers pressed their faces against the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the legendary Reaper who had returned from the dead. Their whispered conversations created a low buzz of excitement that penetrated even the tavern's thick walls. Thomas Hartwell approached Ezra with obvious reverence, his young face flushed with excitement at meeting a figure from maritime history. "Captain Blackwood, sir, my father served under Admiral Vernon in the Caribbean. He used to tell me stories about your boarding actions against the slave ships. Said you freed more souls than any 10 other captains combined." Ezra's expression darkened with old memories and older guilt. Every life saved came at the cost of lives taken, lad. I've spent 3 years trying to forget the sound of dying men calling for their mothers. Violence may sometimes be necessary, but it always carries a price that extends beyond the grave. A group of young sailors had gathered near the tavern entrance, their eyes bright with hero worship as they stared at the man whose exploits had become legend throughout the Caribbean. One of them, barely 18 with the soft hands of a merchant marine recruit, worked up the courage to speak. "Captain, sir, would you consider teaching us some of your fighting techniques? The seas are still dangerous, and pirates still prey on honest ships." But Ezra shook his head firmly, his pale eyes reflecting the weight of decades spent in mortal combat. "These old bones prefer peace now, son. But if Captain Morrison thinks it necessary, I might be persuaded to share some knowledge about ship-to-ship combat and boarding procedures. The techniques themselves aren't evil, only the uses men put them to." Morrison's weathered face brightened with interest. "The Harbor Patrol could benefit greatly from your expertise, Captain Blackwood. Pirates may be fewer than in the old days, but smugglers and cutthroats still plague these waters. Having the Reaper himself train our men would be an honor and a practical necessity." As the constables finished securing Iron Jack's crew and began the process of transporting them to the harbor jail, Morrison lingered to speak privately with Ezra. The harbor captain's voice dropped to a respectful whisper as he addressed the legendary fighter. "Sir, I have to ask, are you planning to stay in port permanently? Or is this just a temporary return to the old life?" Ezra looked around the damaged tavern, his gaze settling on Mary as she began the process of cleaning up broken glass and overturned furniture. The young woman worked with quiet determination, already transforming the scene of violence back into a place of comfort and hospitality. "I came here to escape my past, Captain Morrison. But tonight taught me that a man's past has a way of finding him, whether he wants it to or not. Perhaps it's time I stopped running from who I was and tried to make something better of who I am." 3 months had passed since the night violence had returned to Captain Ezra Blackwood's carefully constructed peaceful existence, and the waterfront had settled into a new rhythm shaped by the presence of a living legend. The tavern where it all began now bore a different name, carved into a weathered wooden sign that swayed gently in the salt breeze above the front door: the Bone Knife. Mary Thornton had insisted on the change, arguing that the establishment needed a fresh start after the blood that had been spilled on its floors. What she had not told anyone, including Ezra himself, was that she had used her savings to buy out the previous owner and was now the sole proprietor of the renamed establishment. Ezra discovered this only when she presented him with a partnership agreement that made him a silent investor in exchange for the protection his mere presence provided. The old captain sat at his customary corner table on a Tuesday evening, watching the young sailors who now gathered weekly for what had become known as maritime combat instruction. Captain Morrison had formalized the arrangement, and every week a dozen Harbor Patrol recruits would crowd into the tavern's back room to learn the deadly skills that had made Ezra Blackwood a legend throughout the Caribbean. Tonight's lesson focused on rope work and boarding techniques, practical skills that could save lives in the dangerous waters around the port. Ezra demonstrated the proper way to secure a running noose and the 17 different knots that could be tied one-handed while holding a weapon. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he spoke in his quiet, authoritative voice. "Remember, lads, these techniques exist to preserve life, not to take it. Every man you face in combat is someone's son, possibly someone's father. When skill gives you the choice between death and mercy, choose mercy when you can afford it." Thomas Hartwell, now promoted to full harbor master after his predecessor's retirement, sat in the front row taking careful notes. The young man's respect for Ezra had only grown over the past months, especially after witnessing how the legendary fighter had chosen rehabilitation over revenge for Iron Jack and his crew. Speaking of which, Iron Jack Malone himself appeared in the tavern's doorway, his massive frame somewhat reduced by 3 months of hard labor on the harbor fortifications. The giant's earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by humble gratitude, and his hands bore the honest calluses of a man who had learned the value of legitimate work. "Captain Blackwood, sir," Jack said, removing his work cap and holding it respectfully in his scarred hands. I wanted to thank you again for the recommendation letter you wrote to the Charleston Shipping Company. They've offered me a position as a loading supervisor, honest work that will let me send money home to my family. Ezra nodded approvingly, studying the transformed man who had once terrorized the waterfront with casual violence. You've earned that chance, Jack. 3 months ago, you were a predator who preyed on the innocent. Today, you're a man who's learned the difference between strength and bullying. See that you remember that lesson. After Jack left to catch the evening tide to Charleston, Mary approached Ezra's table with a steaming bowl of fish stew and a fresh mug of dark rum. Her green eyes sparkled with contentment as she settled into the chair across from him, a ritual they had developed over the past months. The young sailors are getting better, she observed, gesturing toward the back room where the training session was winding down. Thomas says their rope work has improved dramatically since you started teaching them. Ezra's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. They're good lads with the right intentions. In the old days, I taught killing techniques to men who were already killers. Now I teach survival skills to men who want to protect others. The difference matters more than I realized. As the evening wore on and the tavern slowly emptied, Ezra found himself alone with his thoughts and memories. The whalebone knife hung at his belt, a constant reminder of the 43 lives he had taken in the name of justice and the protection of the innocent. Each name was burned into his memory with perfect clarity, along with the faces of the men who had died by his hand. But tonight, for the first time in years, those memories carried less weight. The faces of the men he had taught to fight with honor, the gratitude in Mary's eyes, the transformation he had witnessed in Iron Jack. All of these things served as counterbalances to the darkness of his past. Mary returned from securing the tavern for the night, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor as she approached his table. She had changed from her working dress into a simple blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders. "You're thinking about the past again," she said, settling back into her chair. "I can always tell when those old ghosts come visiting." Ezra nodded slowly, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of ice in firelight. 43 men I killed, Mary. Each one someone's son, brother, father perhaps. I told myself they were all murderers and slavers who deserved death, and most of them were. But lately I've been wondering about the ones who might have been redeemed, given the chance Jack received. Mary reached across the table and placed her small hand over his scarred knuckles, her touch warm and comforting. "You can't change the past, Ezra, but you can shape the future. Those young sailors you're training will save lives because of what you've taught them. Jack Malone will support his family through honest work because you showed him mercy. That has to count for something in whatever accounting book the Almighty keeps." After Mary retired to her rooms above the tavern, Ezra remained at his table as the oil lamps burned low and the sounds of the port settled into the quiet rhythms of night. From his belt, he drew not the whalebone knife, but a smaller tool, a carving knife used for detailed scrimshaw work. From his coat pocket, he produced a piece of fresh whalebone, a gift from a grateful whaling captain whose ship Ezra had helped defend against pirates the previous month. Working by lamplight, his weathered hands began the delicate process of carving a small toy ship, complete with tiny masts and rigging. The gift was intended for Mary's nephew, a boy of 7 who had recently lost his father to fever and now lived with his aunt above the tavern. The same hands that had dealt death to 43 men now worked with infinite patience to create something that would bring joy to a grieving child. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky and the port stirred to life around him, Ezra completed his carving. The tiny ship was a perfect miniature of a merchant vessel, the kind that carried honest cargo and honest sailors to distant shores. He set it carefully on the table and examined his work with the critical eye of a master craftsman. Outside, the morning watch was calling the hour, and early fishing boats were preparing to depart with the tide. The Bone Knife Tavern had become more than just a place of business in the months since its rechristening. It had become a sanctuary for honest sailors and a symbol of redemption for men who had lost their way. Ezra rose from his table and walked to the window overlooking the harbor, watching the ships prepare for another day of honest commerce. The whalebone knife at his belt felt lighter somehow, its weight balanced by the knowledge that his hands could create as well as destroy, protect as well as punish. The legendary Reaper of the Caribbean was truly dead now, His violent legacy transformed into something more valuable than fear. In his place stood a teacher, a protector, and a reminder that even the most blood-stained past could be redeemed through service to others. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption on the high seas, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of honor, courage, and second chances. We bring you tales of men and women who prove that it's never too late to change course and sail toward a better horizon. Until next time, may fair winds and following seas guide your journey toward redemption.